Streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and blasttheradio.com, this is The Lowell Green Show. The number to call and be heard around the world is 613-413-2217. Or email Lowell at blasttheradio.com. And now, here is Lowell Green.
Thank you, John. I have a question for you today. Spent a lot of time thinking about this, done some research. In your opinion, has the time come to make voting, at least at the provincial and federal election, mandatory? I don't ask this lightly. There's a letter to the editor of The Sun today from somebody who's almost boasting over the fact that they're not going to be voting tomorrow. This apparently, to them, is a badge of honor. And I've heard this kind of statement, this kind of argument before. It drives me crazy. The attitude just drives me wacko. Because as far as I am concerned, voting is a civic duty. Just as serving on juries is a civic duty. If they call you for jury service, you've got to do it, unless you have a very compelling reason not to. It is a civic duty. And I believe that voting should be a civic duty. And there's something else, and I don't know how many of you people have actually thought of this, but you know, it's very dangerous not to vote. Let me explain why. Because failure to vote leaves governing to the radicals. Radicals will always show up at the polls. Let me use just one example, and I'm just using this as an example of exactly what I'm talking about, okay? You can be certain for sure that pro-life supporters will always turn up at the polls. Almost all pro-life supporters are very adamant. I don't know if radical is the word, but they're very adamant. They're very definite in their views. And they care a lot. They care enough to show up at the polls, as just one example. But if those who are in favor of choice stay away in large numbers, then inevitably the pro-lifers will win. Oh, what do you think happened in those 2 or 3 American states where women are waking up to find out that their right to abortion has now been lost? I'll tell you what happened. The pro-lifers showed up in full numbers. Those who believe in freedom of choice didn't show up in full numbers. So guess who won? They're blaming, of course, the pro-lifers. I don't blame the pro-lifers. They only did their civic duty. They had a strongly held belief. They cared enough to show up at the polls. They voted. And because not enough people on the other side showed up, the pro-lifers won. So women, including those who believe in freedom of choice, are waking up in some American states today to find out that their right to abortion is either lost or may soon be lost. That's what happens. Those with strongly held views, which would include radicals, always vote. Keep that in mind, all right? Now, I've examined other countries. Do they have mandatory voting in other countries? Yes, they do. Many countries today have mandatory voting, and in almost every case, it works very well. Australia, for example, has had mandatory voting since 1924. Did you know that? And not only did 90% of the voting population cast ballots in the 2019 federal election in Australia, but recent polling there shows that mandatory voting in Australia is supported by about 70% of the population. Large overwhelming majority of the Australian population understands the importance of voting. They agree it's a civic duty, and they are very pleased over the fact that in any given election, the voting turnout is generally in the 90% range. I might point out that mandatory voting is also very successful and popular in countries like Belgium, Brazil, Luxembourg, and several others. In Australia, people say, well, what happens in Australia and these other countries if they don't vote? Well, in Australia, if you don't vote, you get a letter demanding to know why. And unless you can prove that you are on death's bed or otherwise unable to get to a polling station, you will be fined between 20 and 50 Australian dollars. Not a whole lot, but obviously enough to ensure people, most of them, show up at the polls. 90% turnout in Australia in the 2019 election. Here in Canada, during our last federal election, you know what the voter turnout was? 67%. And in past years, it's dropped to almost 60%. We have had federal elections in this country where almost 40% of the population didn't care enough about democracy, didn't care enough about civic duty, didn't care enough about their neighbors, their country, their community to bother voting, to take 15, 20 minutes, half an hour out of every 4 years to vote. 40% almost. And as a matter of fact, I will bet you dollars to donuts, a cruller from Tim Hortons, that less than 60% turn out to the polls tomorrow for the provincial election. I will be very surprised if we don't have more than 40% of the population couldn't care enough about democracy, their community, their neighbors, or their country to bother voting. I'll be thrilled if we have a turnout that's more than 60%. And you know, and I've mentioned this before, um, the Bahamas doesn't have mandatory voting, but they take democracy so seriously. It's relatively new there. Independence is relatively new. They take it so seriously that if the voting turnout does not exceed 90%, the newspapers go ape sweat. I can remember the last federal election in the Bahamas, and the voter turnout was only about 94%. And the newspapers were just absolutely beside themselves with rage. 6% of our population don't care enough about our country to show up to vote. Can you imagine? It's not mandatory, but they care about it in the Bahamas. They care about their country. There was a time when they didn't have the right to vote, and now they do, and by God, they are. Just as one example. But in Canada, as I say, last federal election, 67% turnout. And there have been times when almost 40% for various elections didn't bother to turn out. Um, I just want to reiterate once again. You know, some people just poo-poo at the idea of civic duties. But you know, if we are going to have a successful democratic country, there are certain civic duties. I believe some of them are to look after neighbors who can't look after themselves, to look after the less fortunate than ourselves. We do this through our tax system. I believe that we have a responsibility to our children to do what we can, and there's a civic duty, and this is spelled out in law when it comes to jury. If you get a letter saying that you've got jury duty, you have to do it. There's no such letter that comes for voting, but I believe that voting is a civic duty just as jury duty is a civic duty. But I also reiterate, folks, if we don't, then what happens is if only the radicals, those who held firmly held beliefs, if they only are the ones who vote or vote in large numbers, then what happens is not representative of the total population. If 40% of the population does not bother to vote, then really the election is not a true reflection of the preference of Canadian people. Now, this letter in the Sun from the person boasting about not going to vote said, well, none of the candidates are good enough, etc., etc. This is nonsense. I'll bet you dollars to donuts, 2 crullers this time, that this person has no idea who his candidates are. has never talked to a candidate, has no idea what the platforms are. You know what this person is? He's just a lazy son of a bitch. That's as far as I'm concerned. If you don't vote, you're just a lazy, uncaring, callous son of a bitch. Simple as that. Sorry to be so blunt, but that's my view here. We have a duty. If we're going to run a successful democratic country, then this is the one of the major civic duties we've got. You got to vote. And this, by the way, this entails you learn a little bit about the candidates. I'll bet you dollars to donuts this letter writer and almost everybody that doesn't vote has no idea. For example, I mean, in any given election, there's usually if you don't like the candidates, there's usually a choice between platforms. Now, you may not understand all the platforms, but generally speaking, we know that liberals and NDP mean higher taxes, conservatives mean lower taxes. Lower taxes may mean fewer social programs. More taxes means more social programs. So at least we know that, at least we can make up our mind. Do we want lower taxes or do we want more social programs? If nothing else, that decision is out there and everybody should understand it. Simple. Simple as that. So don't tell me, oh, well, I don't know the candidate. And you know what? If you don't think there are any good candidates out there, then help us find some. We have in Ontario, we've got what, two new parties now, the Ontario Party and the Blue Party and so forth. I think it's nonsense, but this is democracy. They didn't feel that the candidates that were available were suitable. They didn't fulfill their desires, so they formed their own party. Good for them. That's democracy, true democracy. All right, John. Let's hear what if anybody out there agrees with me. I say the time has come. If we can, if 35 to 40% of us don't care enough about this country to turn out to vote, I say, you know what? There's going to be a penalty. You don't care about this country. You don't care about your neighborhood. You don't care about your neighbors. You don't care about our children. Then you know what? There's a price to that. And it may only be 20, $50, but God bless me, there's a price to it, okay? You're going to abandon your duty. There's a price to be paid. John, what are people saying?
I find it interesting your take on that, and I agree with you. I take the voting thing very seriously. I've never missed voting. I remember the first time I voted. Ahead of me was a woman who had just immigrated to Canada, and she broke down in tears, crying. It was that overwhelming for her to finally have the opportunity to vote, and that's always stuck with me. But I'm frustrated by the lack of candidates coming to my door, even dropping off something about them to inform me of them. I've received nothing from the Liberal candidate. I've received nothing from the Conservative candidate. I've received nothing from anybody except the NDP candidate.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, let's face it. I've walked the streets. I've campaigned on two occasions, and I mean, there's no way that a candidate can reach anywhere near all of the people. I mean, in many ridings, we're looking at 20, 30,000
Sure.
people. And that's the problem.
But you can't get a postcard to my door? I mean, that should be fairly straightforward, Lowell.
Well, but I think that if they don't, I think that we have a duty. You may disagree with me here. I think that if the candidate has not been at your door, I think it's your duty to contact them and say, listen, I need some information. That's all you got to do. And I'll tell you, if you show interest in the party, you'll get information. And if you don't, forget them. But my experience is, if you are, and if you like a party, send them a little bit of money. Then you'll be on their voters list forever. But this idea that all of the responsibility has got to be for the candidates, and that's not true. We as individuals, John, we have a responsibility.
No, I
And one,
I accept
yep,
that. I
yep,
accept that
okay,
argument. But going back to when Jace and I had that conversation with you a couple weeks back, they're running a Conservative candidate here in South Ottawa who is all of 18
yep,
years old, whose Facebook page isn't open, who doesn't have a campaign office. There's not even a phone number to call. I have done my homework and tried to research them,
yeah.
and that's what I find frustrating because I am doing my due diligence and
Yeah,
I
well,
am
but
investigating
you've got to.
candidates.
You have, this is an anomaly. I'm going to tell you that
Fair enough. Yep.
very few right. This is an anomaly that you're stuck with.
I've never seen that before, and it strikes me as
But
unbelievable. By the
John,
way,
excuse me, you're a very influential guy, and maybe I'm getting too old for this, but maybe you and I should go out and try and find a better candidate. I have done this. I've helped recruit some candidates, including some who are now serving both federal and provincial, and work for them. So we. I think somehow or other we've created a society where we think that somebody else is going to do it for us.
Yeah.
Our neighbor's going to do it. Government's going to do it. Well, but we have a responsibility. This is our country, our neighborhood, our children, our lives, our homes. We have a responsibility too. And that's so, John, you're a very influential guy. If we can't get a decent guy, then maybe you should go after somebody. I, it's the same thing with mayoralty. I've got a couple of possible candidates in mind,
Yep. Yep.
and
I
I'm
know.
going to go after them, and I'm going to shake the tree a little bit on this, son, and see if we can't convince some good people to run.
And
Okay, John.
on jury duty, I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you. I can't believe the number of people that will even post on social media. Oh, I got called for jury duty. What a pain in the ass. Da, 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 da. And they fight it. It's
Yeah.
that's part
Well,
of
jury
living
duty
in this.
can be very onerous. I mean, sometimes these
Absolutely.
juries will sit for weeks,
But to try and
I understand.
but to just poo-poo it, I mean, that's
Yeah.
part of what makes us, like you said, a democracy. Okay, enough of me.
You know
6-1.
what? But I see. Let me just respond to that.
Sure, sure, sure.
We have, of the people for the people. Well, if the people don't take part in jury duty, then who's going to make the decision as to guilt and innocence? That's a
Not my
responsibility.
problem,
It,
right,
it
Lowell?
can
Not
be
my
onerous.
problem.
It can be onerous. It can be onerous to find a decent candidate and go out and work and walk with them. That can be onerous and a pain in the ass, no question.
Yep.
But you can't have democracy without it. You can't. And ask the people in Russia today how they feel about it. Ask the people in North Korea. Ask the people in Venezuela how they feel about being denied the right to vote. Go ahead, John, please.
All right, enough of me. Let's get to the listeners. 613-413-2217 is the number. You can post on Facebook, both my Facebook, Lowell's Facebook, the Blast the Radio Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, and Twitter. Lowell, if you make it mandatory, you'll get a bunch of misinformed voters more than likely voting for social parties. At least the people who vote care. Australia has
No,
had a liberal government. Go ahead.
no, that's wrong. That's not what happens. Actually, what happens, and as I say, they've found this in Australia. 70% of people in Australia polled support mandatory voting. They say no. You know what happens? That this, among other things, compels people to start paying more attention. You get better representation. This idea that only dumb people. No, I don't agree with that at all. Besides which, everybody, no matter what your walk of life, your income, you have a civic duty. It's your duty, damn it. Go ahead, John.
To Facebook, and Ann says, I was called to jury duty and went and was sad I was not selected as they got enough members by the time they got to me. Craig says, if you make it mandatory, you'll find more people will pay attention. Peter says,
Precisely. That's what they found. Belgium, by the way, I've done some research on Belgium, and Belgium figures that mandatory voting has increased voting participation by about 20%. And as a consequence, they find that they have a better informed public. If you're going to have to vote, enough. Some people, of course, still they'll just put an X anywhere. But many people say, you know what? If I have to show up, at least the very least, I'll see what I can find out here. Go ahead.
so who institutes this mandatory voting?
It's in Australia and Belgium,
Well,
Brazil. It's
who would make that happen here? That would have to be passed in the House of Commons, would it not?
well, yes, it would. Yes, for
So if you've
federal
got a
voting.
party that is benefiting from a low voter turnout, how likely are they then to put that into law? That's my question.
Yeah, well, but you know what? This is once again we're talking about the civic duty of people to speak up. I've said before, John, that if an MP or MPP were to receive 100 letters,
Yep.
100 phone calls on any given issue, they would run scared. I'm going to tell you, no matter what the issue, there is no MP who ever would get 100 responses unless it's one of these manufactured petitions.
Sure.
But I mean, we've got a population of what, 35 million people here, and if an MP gets 100 letters, he or she jumps. Believe me.
Oh, yeah. If they think you're paying attention, suddenly they will
That's
too.
right.
All
That's
right,
right.
back to the comments we go. Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, and of course 613-413-2217 to Twitch. And Terry says, those that take the time to vote are usually well-informed people who care. If you don't vote, do not complain. Tom says, as it's always said, if you don't vote, do not complain. Susan says, yes, get out and vote, for sure, folks. I have mixed feelings, says Anne, on mandatory voting. If you're not informed on the issues and the choices available, should you actually be voting?
Yeah, but you know what? I mean, some people who do show up to vote, they're unaware of the issues as well. That argument I don't think holds water anymore. There'll always be irresponsible people, no matter what it is. Have a drive in the driveway if you want to find irresponsible people, but but just because there are irresponsible people out there driving, don't mean that it doesn't mean that we don't have the police to enforce the laws. Okay, go ahead.
Let's go to text. Yes, voting should be mandatory, and anyone who wants to politically demonstrate should have to register their names so that it can be compared to the voting list. And if you don't vote, then you have no democratic right to protest. That's Barry's comment. Let's go to Peter. Federally, it would have to be done based on my knowledge, as you usually register to vote on your income tax yearly. Darlene says, I'm usually against mandatory anything, but yes, people must vote to reframe from voting on personality or looks. Michelle, I begged off voting because I couldn't afford to take time off work, but now, as a semi-retired person, I'd love to do jury duty.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't employers have to give you time off for voting?
100%.
I see. I don't. These arguments. I mean,
And you get paid for your jury duty.
no, I'm talking. Yeah, I, I'm not sure whether people are just misinformed or whether they're just presenting us with excuses. Go ahead. Look, I mean, to vote, and not only that, but now they have advanced polling. And anybody that tells me, oh, they haven't got time, I don't believe it for a moment. Go ahead.
You know what? We're 22 minutes into a 30-minute show. Let's get a word in for our friends at Shields, shall we?
Yes. Thank you very much. I need to be reminded. Shields. Yeah. Once again, folks, we're dealing with people that are responsible. They've been in business, same location, same family since 1947. And as I've said many times before, you're going to stay in business and do well for that length of time. You're doing something right, and they do a lot right at Shields. The assortment of appliances as good as you're going to find anywhere, and it's in stock. 99% of what you would require is already there in stock, which means that they can have it in your door certainly within the week, unless there's vastly different extenuating circumstances. And the price, once again, I'm telling you, compare the price, folks. I'm looking at the website right now, www.shields.ca. It's a very easy website to use. You can compare the prices, the appliances that are available, styles, models, colors, etc. It's all there, easy to use. Shields.ca. Good people. Good people. Go ahead, John.
All right, Simon just commented on Facebook. Let's go to his comment now. He says, how about all the eligible voters must pass a basic civics exam to prove that they can vote? Create two classes of citizens with more benefits for those who can vote. Warning, contains satire. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No, I don't agree with that. No.
It contains satire.
Yeah.
As a former employer, Tom says, I had to give my employees time off to vote. I believe they get 4 hours.
Yeah. So this idea that I couldn't get time off work, that doesn't hold water. And by the way, you can vote online. As Debbie says, you can vote online now. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, not aware of that either, but Debbie is well informed. Murray says they have set payment and might not be the wage you get at your workplace. I think we're talking about jury duty there, because you are compensated for jury duty. I believe it's minimum wage.
Yeah.
Peter says, yes, employers have to give you time off from work, and there was tens of thousands of advanced polling this time, plus mail-in kits. If in hospital, they will come to you. If in a nursing home, they will come to you. Even have poll locations in nursing homes, etc. They will make it very easy for you to vote.
Thank you. No excuse. The only excuse you have for not voting is such serious illness that you simply cannot get there and you can't get anybody in. But 99% of the time, it's people who just don't care about their country. They don't care about democracy. But I repeat, it's very dangerous because the radicals will always show up. There are a lot of radical environmentalists. And if the radical environmentalists all show up, folks, We don't have an energy industry, okay? That's, I mean, ask them in some of these states in the United States where women have now lost the right to abortion, what happens when the radicals take over. There's the evidence. You don't think it can happen? Well, explain that to some of the women in the United States. Go ahead, please, John.
Here's an email from Lisa. The address is Lowell@blasttheradio.com. Lowell, I'm voting. I just hope that the politician who wins stands by their word and keeps their promises and stop blowing smoke up my arse. Stop giving away money to corporations that do absolutely nothing that enriches or improves many lives. Let's go back to Facebook. No, let's go. Yeah, Lori, I've always voted. We need to do our duty. Mike says a lot of liberals vote liberal just because that's what they've always
Yeah, but
done.
once again, people are not responding to my question. It's a tough question. I'm asking you to think about it and make a decision here. Make a decision. Should it be mandatory? That's the question. Not should you vote? Of course you should. Do politicians blow smoke up your ass? Yeah, some of them do. But that's not the question. The question is, should it be mandatory? mandatory, mandatory. That's my question. Go ahead.
Here's a direct answer to your question from Murray. There is no excuse. You're right, Lowell. Kelly, as a woman, it's important to vote, considering we had to fight for the right to vote. In other countries, women are still not allowed.
Yeah, but should it be mandatory? See, this always bothers me is people have difficulty in making a hard decision. You expect the politicians to make hard decisions, and yet, well-intentioned people can't make a decision. Should it be mandatory or not? Go ahead.
Yes, I think it should be mandatory, says Mike. Like you said, it would make people pay attention more. No, it should not be mandatory, says Darlene. Yes, it should be mandatory, says Tom. So we're back.
Okay, at least they're thinking about it. Okay.
There you go. Lowell, would it be helpful going forward when you ask direct questions like that I actually post the question on screen to encourage people to just give?
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. Yeah, but I mind you, I've been doing at this game for over 60 years, and I've seen this time and time again. A lot of people, they have difficulty in making a decision, and in this case I'm just asking a simple question because it requires, in many cases it requires people to think about something they haven't really thought that much about before. But don't expect politicians to make hard decisions on major issues. If you're having difficulty making a decision on an issue like this, go ahead, please, John.
Well, there it is. It's going across the bottom of the screen now. Should voting be mandatory? Yes or no? That is the question we are seeking the answer
Thank you.
All right. Going forward, I will make sure to make that happen earlier on in the show. Eileen says, yes, it should be mandatory. Too many lazy people out there not voting. Yes to mandatory, says Ray. It should be mandatory, says Barbara. If they can mandate the census be completed or they hound you to death.
Yeah, you know what? They make you pay taxes. That's mandatory. That's
right.
Paying your taxes is a civic duty, okay? And if you don't do it, God help you. Go ahead, please.
Yes to your question, says Susan. Somebody asked the question earlier. I can't remember who it was, but I did see it go by the screen. Okay, what would the consequences be if you don't vote? You started to address that with there's a $20 to $50 fine in Australia if you don't. So what?
Yeah, in Australia, here's the way it works. Okay, I've done a fair amount of research. They've had mandatory voting there since 1924. It's very popular. About 70% of the Australian people support mandatory voting. They feel that it's been very beneficial, and it does get people to pay more attention. So in Australia, if you don't show up to vote, as you know, I mean, even today, records are kept of who votes here. We have voting lists. If you don't show up to vote, you get a letter from the government, and it says you didn't show up to vote. Do you have an explanation? And if you can't prove, for example, with doctor's certificates that you were too ill or whatever, then you are fined. It's and there's very little argument. They either buy your argument or they don't. And the fine is somewhere between $20 and $50 Australian. Not a lot of money, but very clearly, just the thought that it's mandatory and that there is a penalty to be paid is sufficient to make voting turnout about 90%.
Here's a post that is getting a lot of traction from Caroline. She says, yes, with a tax credit if you vote. A lot of people liking that idea. Yes to mandatory voting, says Cindy. Sorry, Lowell, says Kelly, late listening, but yes, it should be. Why not? Election should be more hours next and representative of the people. What would the cutoff date be, asks Lori. Lots of very old people here.
What do you mean?
I don't know.
I mean, voting day. There's advanced polling, etc.
Right.
Cutoff date is, what is it, 8 o'clock at night on the vote to, like tomorrow. The voting
Yeah.
is all day long, and the cutoff is what, 8 or 9. I'm not sure what the time is.
Yeah, and you have at least a half dozen opportunities at advanced polls, don't you? Something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Listen, I want to thank you all. We've got some very good response here,
Yeah.
and I think that's a good idea. Post the question on the internet so people can see the question.
Learning
Thank
as we
you
go
all.
here, sir.
Thank you all. We're going out. I just got myself a saltwater aquarium here. We're all very excited. Clownfish, Nemo. Is it Nemo? Yeah.
Yeah.
Running all over my living room here. And we're going out to get a few crabs.
Oh, good.
My wife thinks this is really funny. She says, there's enough crabs in this house. Thank you all. We'll be back tomorrow.
The Lowell Green Show is seen and heard live around the world at 2 p.m. Eastern. Connect with us online at blasttheradio.com/Lowell Green. Can't join us live? Download the Lowell Green podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, Google, and more. Ask your smart speaker to play the Lowell Green podcast. This is a production of blasttheradio.com.